Part 2 of Chapter 2 of Following the Color Line, An Account of Negro Citizenship in the American Democracy, by Ray Stannard Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Negro Boycott. Of course, this was an unusually intelligent colored man, and he spoke for his own sort. How far the same feeling of a race consciousness strong enough to carry out such a boycott as this, and it is like the boycott of a labor union, actuates the masses of ignorant Negroes is a question upon which I hope to get more light as I proceed. I have already heard more than one colored leader complain that Negroes do not stand together, and a white planter whom I met in the hotel said a significant thing along this very line. If once the Negroes got together and saved their money, they'd soon own the country, but they can't do it, and they never will. After I had begun to trace the color line, I found evidences of it everywhere, literally in every department of life. In the theaters, Negroes never sit downstairs, but the galleries are black with them. Of course, white hotels and restaurants are entirely barred to Negroes, with the result that colored people have their own eating and sleeping places, many of them inexpressibly dilapidated and unclean. "Sleepers wanted" is a familiar sign in Atlanta, giving notice of places where for a few cents a Negro can find a bed or a mattress on the floor, often in a room where there are many other sleepers, sometimes both men and women in the same room crowded together in a manner both unsanitary and immoral. No good public accommodations exist for the educated or well-to-do Negro in Atlanta, although other cities are developing good Negro hotels. Indeed, one cannot long remain in the South without being impressed with extreme difficulties which beset the exceptional coloured man. In slavery time many Negroes attended white churches, and Negro children were often taught by white women. Now a Negro is never, or very rarely, seen in a white man's church. Once since I have been in the South I saw a very old Negro woman, some much loved mammy, perhaps, sitting down in front near the pulpit, but that is the only exception to the rule that has come to my attention. Negroes are not wanted in white churches. Consequently, the coloured people have some 60 churches of their own in Atlanta. Of course, the schools are separate, and have been ever since the Civil War. In one of the parks of Atlanta I saw this sign: "No Negroes allowed in this park." Color line in the public library. A story significant of the growing separation of the races is told about the public library at Atlanta, which no Negro is permitted to enter. Carnegie gave the money for building it, and when the question came up as to the support of it by the city, the inevitable color question arose. Leading Negroes asserted that their people should be allowed admittance, that they needed such an educational advantage even more than white people, and that they were led to be taxed their share, even though it was small, for buying the books and maintaining the building. They did not win their point, of course, but Mr. Carnegie proposed a solution of the difficulty by offering more money to build a Negro branch library, provided the city would give the land and provide for its support. The city said to the Negroes, "You contribute the land and we will support the library." Influential Negroes at once arranged for buying and contributing a site for the library. Then the question of control arose. The Negroes thought that inasmuch as they gave the land and the building was to be used entirely for coloured people, they should have 1 or 2 members on the board of control. This the city officials, who had charge of the matter, would not hear of. Result? The Negroes would not give the land, and the branch library has never been built. Right in this connection, while I was in Atlanta, the art school, which in the past has often used Negro models, decided to draw the color line there too, and no longer employ them. Formerly Negroes and white men went to the same saloons, and drank at the same bars, as they do now, I am told, in some parts of the South. In a few instances, in Atlanta, there were Negro saloon keepers and many Negro bartenders. The first step toward separation was to divide the bar, the upper end for white men, the lower for Negroes. After the riot, by a new ordinance, no saloon was permitted to serve both white and colored men. Consequently, going along Decatur Street, one sees the saloons designated by conspicuous signs: "Whites only," "Colored only." And when the Negro suffers the ordinary consequences of a prolonged visit to Decatur Street, and finds himself in the city prison, he is separated there, too, from the whites. And afterward in court, if he comes to trial, 2 Bibles are provided. He may take his oath on one, the other is for the white man. When he dies he is buried in a separate cemetery. One curious and enlightening example of the infinite ramifications of the color line was given me by Mr. Logan, secretary of the Atlanta Associated Charities, which is supported by voluntary contributions. One day after the riot, a subscriber called Mr. Logan on the telephone and said, "Do you help Negroes in your society?" "Why, yes, occasionally," said Mr. Logan. "What do you do that for?" "A Negro gets hungry and cold like everybody else," answered Mr. Logan. "Well, you can strike my name from your subscription list. I won't give any of my money to a society that helps Negroes." Psychology of the South. Now, this sounds rather brutal, but behind it lies the peculiar psychology of the South. This very man who refused to contribute to the Associated Charities may have fed several Negroes from his kitchen and had a number of Negro pensioners who came to him regularly for help. It was simply amazing to me, considering the bitterness of racial feeling, to see how lavish many white families are in giving food, clothing, and money to individual Negroes whom they know. A Negro cook often supports her whole family, including a lazy husband, on what she gets daily from the white man's kitchen. In some old families the basket habit of the Negroes is taken for granted. In the newer ones it is significantly beginning to be called stealing, showing that the old order is passing, and that the Negro is being held more and more strictly to account, not as a dependent vassal, but as a moral being, who must rest upon his own responsibility. And often a Negro of the old sort will literally bulldoze his hereditary white protector into the loan of quarters and $half, which both know will never be paid back. Mr. Britton, superintendent of schools in Fulton County, gave me an incident in point. A big Negro with whom he was wholly unacquainted came to his office one day and demanded, he did not ask but demanded, a job. "What's your name?" asked the superintendent. "Marion Luther Britton," was the reply. "That sounds familiar," said Mr. Britton, it being indeed his own name. "Yes, sir. I'm the son of your old mammy." In short, Marion Luther had grown up on the old plantation. It was the spirit of the hereditary vassal demanding the protection and support of the hereditary baron, and he got it, of course. The Negro who makes his appeal on the basis of this old relationship finds no more indulgent or generous friend than the Southern white man, indulgent to the point of excusing thievery and other petty offenses. But the moment he assumes or demands any other relationship, or stands up as an independent citizen, the white men, at least some white men, turn upon him with the fiercest hostility. The incident of the Associated Charities may now be understood. It was not necessarily cruelty to a cold or hungry Negro that inspired the demand of the irate subscriber, but the feeling that the Associated Charities helped Negroes and whites on the same basis, as men, that, therefore, it encouraged social equality, and that, therefore, it was to be stopped. Most of the examples so far given are along the line of social contact, where, of course, the repulsion is intense. Negroes and whites can go to different schools, churches, and saloons, and sit in different street cars, and still live pretty comfortably. But the longer I remain in the South, the more clearly I come to understand how wide and deep, in other less easily discernible ways, the chasm between the races is becoming. The New Racial Consciousness Among Negroes. One of the natural and inevitable results of the effort of the white man to set the Negro off as a race by himself is to awaken in him a new consciousness, a sort of racial consciousness. It drives the Negroes together for defense and offense. Many able Negroes, some largely of white blood, cut off from all opportunity of success in the greater life of the white man, becomes of necessity leaders of their own people. And one of their chief efforts consists in urging Negroes to work together and to stand together. In this they are only developing the instinct of defense against the white man which has always been latent in the race. This instinct exhibits itself in the way in which the mass of Negroes sometimes refuse to turn over a criminal of their color to white justice. It is like the instinctive clannishness of the Highland Scotch or the peasant Irish. I don't know how many Southern people have told me in different ways of how extremely difficult it is to get at the real feeling of a Negro, to make him tell what goes on in his clubs and churches or in his innumerable societies. A Southern woman told me of a cook who had been in her service for 19 years. The whole family really loved the old servant. Her mistress made her a confidante, in the way of the Old South, in the most intimate private and family matters. The daughters told her their love affairs. They all petted her, and even submitted to many small tyrannies upon her part. "But do you know," said my hostess, "Susie never tells us a thing about her life or her friends, and we couldn't, if we tried, make her tell what goes on in the society she belongs to." The Negro has long been defensively secretive. Slavery made him that. In the past the instinct was passive and defensive, but with growing education and intelligent leadership it is rapidly becoming conscious, self-directive, and offensive. And right there, it seems to me, lies the great cause of the increased strain in the South. Let me illustrate. In the People's Tabernacle in Atlanta, where thousands of Negroes meet every Sunday, I saw this sign in huge letters: "For photographs, go to Auburn Photo Gallery, operated by colored men." The old-fashioned Negro preferred to go to the white man for everything. He didn't trust his own people. The new Negro, with growing race consciousness, and feeling that the white man is against him, urges his friends to patronize Negro doctors and dentists, and to trade with Negro storekeepers. The extent to which this movement has gone was one of the most surprising things that I, as an unfamiliar Northerner, found in Atlanta. In other words, the struggle of the races is becoming more and more rapidly economic. Story of a Negro Shoe Store. One day, walking in Broad Street, I passed a Negro shoe store. I did not know that there was such a thing in the country. I went in to make inquiries. It was neat, well kept, and evidently prosperous. I found that it was owned by a stock company, organized and controlled wholly by Negroes. The manager was a brisk young mulatto named Harper, a graduate of Atlanta University. I found him dictating to a Negro girl stenographer. There were two reasons, he said, why the store had been opened. One was because the promoters thought it a good business opportunity, and the other was because many Negroes of the better class felt that they did not get fair treatment at white stores. At some places, not all, he said, when a Negro woman went to buy a pair of shoes, the clerk would hand them to her without offering to help her try them on. And a Negro was always kept waiting until all the white people in the store had been served. Since the new business was opened, he said, it had attracted much of the Negro trade, all the leaders advising their people to patronize him. I was much interested to find out how this young man looked upon the race question. His first answer struck me forcibly, for it was the universal and typical answer of the businessman the world over, whether white, yellow, or black. "All I want," he said, "is to be protected and let alone so that I can build up this business." "What do you mean by protection?" I asked. "Well, justice between the races. That doesn't mean social equality. We have a society of our own, and that is all we want. If he can have justice in the courts and fair protection, we can learn to compete with the white stores and get along all right." Such an enterprise as this indicates the new economic separation between the races. "Here is business," says the Negro, "which I am going to do." Considering the fact that only a few years ago the Negro did no business at all and had no professional men, it is really surprising to a Northerner to see what progress he has made. One of the first lines he took up was, not unnaturally, the undertaking business. Some of the most prosperous Negroes in every Southern city are undertakers, doing work exclusively, of course, for colored people. Other early enterprises, growing naturally out of a history of personal service, were barbering and tailoring. Atlanta has many small Negro tailor and clothes cleaning shops. Wealthiest Negro in Atlanta. The wealthiest Negro in Atlanta, A. F. Herndon, operates the largest barber shop in the city. He is the president of a Negro insurance company, of which there are 4 in the city, and he owns and rents some 50 dwelling houses. He is said to be worth $80,000, all made, of course, since slavery. Another occupation developing naturally from the industrial training of slavery was the business of the building contractor. Several such Negroes, notably Alexander Hamilton, do a considerable business in Atlanta, and have made money. They are employed by white men, and they hire for their jobs both white and Negro workmen. Small groceries and other stores are of later appearance. I saw at least a score of them in various parts of Atlanta. For the most part they are very small. Many are exceedingly dirty and ill kept. Usually much poorer than corresponding places kept by foreigners, indiscriminately called Dagoes down here, who are in reality mostly Russian Jews and Greeks. but there are a few Negro grocery stores in Atlanta which are highly creditable. Other business enterprises, including restaurants for Negroes, printing establishments, 2 newspapers, and several drug stores. In other words, the Negro is rapidly building up his own business enterprises, tending to make himself independent as a race. The appearance of Negro drug stores was the natural result of the increasing practice of Negro doctors and dentists. Time was when all Negroes preferred to go to white practitioners, but since educated colored doctors became common, they have taken a very large part, practically all, I am told, of the practice in Atlanta. Several of them have had degrees from Northern universities, 2 from Yale, and one of them, at least, has some little practice among white people. The doctors are leaders among their people. Naturally, they give prescriptions to be filled by druggists of their own race. Hence the growth of the drug business among Negroes everywhere in the South. The first store to be established in Atlanta occupies an old wooden building in Auburn Avenue. It is operated by Moses Amos, a mulatto, and enjoys, I understand, a high degree of prosperity. I visited it. A post office occupies one corner of the room, and it is a familiar gathering place for colored men. Moses Amos told me his story, and I found it so interesting and so significant of the way in which Negro businessmen have come up that I am setting it down briefly here. Rise of a Negro Druggist. "I shall never forget," he said, "my first day in the drug business. It was in 1876. I remember I was with a crowd of boys in Peachtree Street, where Dr. Huss, a Southern white man, kept a drug store. The old doctor was sitting out in front smoking his pipe. He called one little Negro after another and finally chose me. He said, 'I want you to live with me, work in the store, and look after my horse.' He sent me to his house and told me to tell his wife to give me some breakfast. And I certainly delivered the first message correctly. His wife, who was a noble lady, not only fed me, but made me take a bath in a sure enough porcelain tub, the first I had ever seen. When I went back to the store, I was so regenerated that the doctor had to adjust his spectacles before he knew me. He said to me, 'You can wash bottles, put up castor oil, salts, and turpentine, sell anything you know, and put the money in the drawer.' He showed me how to work the keys of the cash drawer. 'I am going to trust you,' he said. 'Don't steal from me. If you want anything, ask for it, and you can have it. And don't lie. I hate a liar. A boy who will lie will steal, too.' I remained with Dr. Huss 13 years. He sent me to school and paid my tuition out of his own pocket. He trusted me fully, often leaving me in charge of his business for weeks at a time. When he died I formed a partnership with Dr. Butler, Dr. Slater, and others, and bought the store. Our business grew and prospered, so that within a few years we had a stock worth $3,000 and a cash of $800. That made us ambitious. We bought land, built a new store, and went into debt to do it. We didn't know much about business. That's the Negro's chief trouble. And we lost trade by changing our location, so that in spite of all we could do, we failed and lost everything, though we finally paid our creditors every cent. After many trials we started again in 1896 in our present store. Today we are doing a good business. We can get all the credit we want from wholesale houses. We employ 6 clerks, and pay good interest on the capital invested." Greatest Difficulties Met by Negro Businessmen. I asked him what was the greatest difficulty he had to meet. He said it was the credit system, the fact that many Negroes have not learned financial responsibility. Once, he said, he nearly stopped business on this account. "I remember," he said, "the last time we got into trouble. We needed $400 to pay our bills. I picked out some of our best customers and gave them a heart-to-heart talk and told them what trouble we were in. They all promised to pay, but on the day set for payment, out of $1,680 which they owed us, we collected just $8.25. After that experience we came down to a cash basis. We trust no one, and since then we have been doing well." He said he thought the best opportunity for Negro development was in the South, where he had his whole race behind him. He said he had once been tempted to go North looking for an opening. "How did you make out?" I asked. "Well, I'll tell you," he said. "When I got there I wanted a shave. I walked the streets 2 hours visiting barber shops, and they all turned me away with some excuse. I finally had to buy a razor and shave myself. That was just a sample. I came home disgusted and decided to fight it out down here where I understood conditions." Of course, only a comparatively few Negroes are able to get ahead in business. They must depend almost exclusively on the trade of their own race, and they must meet the highly organized competition of white men. But it is certainly significant that even a few are able to make progress along these unfamiliar lines. Many Southern men I met had little or no idea of the remarkable extent of this advancement among the better class of Negroes. Here is a strange thing. I don't know how many Southern men have prefaced their talks with me with words something like this: "You can't expect to know the Negro after a short visit. You must live down here like we do. Now, I know the Negroes like a book. I was brought up with them. I know what they'll do and what they won't do. I have had Negroes in my house all my life." But curiously enough, I found that these men rarely knew anything about the better class of Negroes, those who were in business or in independent occupations, those who owned their own homes. They did come into contact with the servant Negro, the field hand, the common laborer, who make up, of course, the great mass of the race. On the other hand, the best class of Negroes did not know the higher class of white people, and based their suspicion and hatred upon the acts of the poorer sort of whites with whom they naturally came into contact. The best elements of the two races are as far apart as though they lived in different continents, and that is one of the chief causes of the growing danger of the Southern situation. It is a striking fact that one of the first, almost instinctive, efforts at Reconstruction after the Atlanta riot was to bring the best elements of both races together, so that they might, by becoming acquainted and gaining confidence in each other, allay suspicion and bring influence to bear upon the lawless elements of both white people and coloured. Many Southerners look back wistfully to the faithful, simple, ignorant, obedient, cheerful, old plantation Negro and deplore his disappearance. They want the New South, but the old Negro. That Negro is disappearing forever along with the old feudalism and the old-time exclusively agricultural life. A new Negro is not less inevitable than a new white man and a new South. And the new Negro, as my clever friend says, doesn't laugh as much as the old one. It is grim business he is in, this being free, this new fierce struggle in the open competitive field for the daily loaf? Many go down to vagrancy and crime in that struggle. A few will rise. The more rapid the progress, with the trained white man setting the pace, the more frightful the mortality. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Following the Color Line, An Account of Negro Citizenship in the American Democracy, by Ray Stannard Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Southern City Negro. After my arrival in Atlanta, and when I had begun to understand some of the more superficial ramifications of the color line, as I related in the last chapter, I asked several Southern men whose acquaintance I had made, where I could see the poorest or criminal class of Negroes. So much has been said of the danger arising from this element of Southern population, and it plays such a part in every discussion of the race question, that I was anxious to learn all I could about it. "Go down any morning to Judge Broyles's court," they said to me, "and you'll see the lowest of the low." So I went down, the first of many visits I made to police and justice courts. I chose a Monday morning, that I might see to the best advantage the accumulation of the arrests of Saturday and Sunday. The police station stands in Decatur Street, in the midst of the very worst section of the city, surrounded by low saloons, dives, and pawn shops. The court occupies a great room upstairs, and it was crowded that morning to its capacity. Besides the police, lawyers, court officers, and white witnesses, at least 150 spectators filled the seats behind the rail, nearly all of them Negroes. The ordinary Negro loves nothing better than to sit and watch the proceedings of a court. Judge Broyles kindly invited me to a seat on the platform at his side, where I could look into the faces of the prisoners and hear all that was said. In a Southern police court. It was a profoundly interesting and significant spectacle. In the first place, the very number of cases was staggering. The docket that morning carried over 100 names, men, women, and children, white and black. The court worked hard, but it was nearly 2:00 in the afternoon before the room was cleared. Atlanta, as I showed in a former chapter, has the largest number of arrests, considering the population, of any important city in the United States. I found that 13,511 of the total of 21,702 persons arrested in 1906 were Negroes, or 62%, whereas the colored population of the city is only 40% of the total. A very large proportion of the arrests that Monday morning were Negroes, with a surprising proportion of women and of mere children. In 1906, 3,194 Negro women were arrested in Atlanta. It was altogether a pitiful and disheartening exhibition, a spectacle of sodden ignorance, reckless vice, dissipation. Most of the cases, raveled out, led back to the saloon. "Where's your home?" the judge would ask, and in a number of cases the answer was, "I come here from the country." Over and over again it was the story of the country Negro, or the Negro who had been working on the railroad, in the cotton fields, or in the sawmills, who had entered upon the more complex life of the city. Most of the country districts of the South prohibit the sale of liquor, and Negroes, especially, have comparatively little temptation of this nature, nor are they subjected to the many other glittering pitfalls of city life. But of late years the opportunities of the city have attracted the black people, just as they have the whites, in large numbers. Atlanta had many saloons and other places of vice, and the results are to be seen in Judge Broyles's court any morning. And not only Negroes, but the poor whites who have come in from the mountains and the small farms to work in the mills. They, too, suffer fully as much as the Negroes. Negro Cocaine Victims. Not a few of the cases, both black and white, showed evidence of cocaine or morphine poisoning, the blear eyes, the unsteady nerves. "What's the trouble here?" asked the judge. "Coke," said the officer. "$10.75," said the judge, naming the amount of the fine. They buy the coke in the form of a powder and snuff it up the nose. A certain patent catarrh medicine, which is nearly all cocaine, is sometimes used. 10 cents will purchase enough to make a man wholly irresponsible for his acts and capable of any crime. The cocaine habit, which seems to be spreading, for there are always druggists who will break the law, has been a curse to the Negro, and has resulted directly, as the police told me, in much crime. I was told of 2 cases in particular of offenses against women in which the Negro was a victim of the drug habit. So society, in pursuit of wealth, South and North, preys upon the ignorant and weak, and then wonders why crime is prevalent. One has only to visit police courts in the South to see in how many curious ways the contact of the races generates fire. "What's the trouble here?" inquires the judge. The white complainant, a boy, says, "This nigger insulted me," and he tells the epithet the Negro applied. "Did you call him that?" "No, sir, never called him no such name." $3.75. You mustn't insult white people. And here is the report of the case of a 6-year-old Negro boy from the Georgian. Because Robert Lee Buster, a 6-year-old Negro boy, insulted Maggie McDermott, a little girl, who lives at 507 Simpson Street, Wednesday afternoon, he was given a whipping in the police station Thursday morning that will make him remember to be good. The case was heard in the juvenile court before Judge Broyles. It was shown that the little Negro had made an insulting remark to the little girl. Story of a Negro Arrest. The very suspicion and fear that exist give rise to many difficulties. One illuminating case came up that morning. A strapping Negro man was brought before the judge. He showed no marks of dissipation and was respectfully dressed. Confronting him were 2 plain-clothes policemen, one with his neck wrapped up, one with a bandage around his arm. Both said that they had been stabbed by the Negro with a jackknife. The Negro said he was a hotel porter, and he had the white manager of the hotel in court to testify to his good character, sobriety, and industry. It seems that he was going home from work at 9 o'clock in the evening, and it was dark. He said he was afraid, and had been afraid since the riot. At the same time, the 2 policemen were looking for a burglar. They saw the Negro porter and ordered him to stop. Not being in uniform, the Negro said he thought the officers were just plain white men who were going to attack him. When he started to run, the officers tried to arrest him, and he drew his jackknife and began to fight. And here he was in court. The judge said, "You mustn't attack officers," and bound him over to trial in the higher court. A White Man and a Negro Woman. Another case shows one of the strange relationships which grow out of Southern conditions. An old white man, much agitated and very pale, was brought before the judge. With him came a much younger, comely appearing woman. Both were well dressed and looked respectable, so much so, indeed, that there was a stir of interest and curiosity among the spectators. Why had they been arrested? As they stood in front of the judge's desk, the old man hung his head, but the woman looked up with such an expression, tearless and tragic, as I hope I shall not have to see again. "What's the charge?" asked the judge. "Adultery," said the officer. The woman winced. The old man did not look up. The judge glanced from one to the other in surprise. "Why don't you get married?" he asked. "The woman," said the officer, "is a nigger." She was as white as I am, probably an octoroon. I could not have distinguished her from a white person, and she deceived even the experienced eye of the judge. "Is that so?" asked the judge. The man continued to hang his head. The woman looked up. Neither said a word. It then came out that they had lived together as man and wife for many years, and that they had children nearly grown. One of the girls, and a very bright, ambitious girl, as I learned later was a student in Atlanta University, a Negro college, where she was supported by her father, who made good wages as a telegraph operator. Some neighbor had complained, and the man and woman were arrested. "Is all this true?" asked the judge. Neither said a word. "You can't marry under the Georgia law," said the judge. "I'll have to bind you over for trial in the county court." They were led back to the prisoners' rooms. A few minutes later the bailiff came out quickly and said to the judge, "The old man has fallen in a faint." Not long afterward they half led, half carried him out across the courtroom. One thing impressed me especially, not only in this court, but in all others I have visited. A Negro brought in for drunkenness, for example, was punished much more severely than a white man arrested for the same offense. The injustice which the weak everywhere suffer, North and South, is in the South visited upon the Negro. The white man sometimes escaped with a reprimand. He was sometimes fined $3 and costs. But the Negro, especially if he had no white man to intercede for him, was usually punished with a $10 or $15 fine, which often meant that he must go to the chain gang. One of the chief causes of complaint by the Negroes of Atlanta has been of the rough treatment of the police and of unjust arrests. After the riot, when the Civic League, composed of the foremost white citizens of Atlanta, was organized, one of the first subjects that came up was that of injustice to the Negro. Mr. Hopkins, the leader of the league, said to me, "We complain that the Negroes will not help to bring the criminals of their race to justice. One reason for that is that the Negro has too little confidence in our courts. We must give him that above all things." In accordance with this plan, the Civic League, heartily supported by Judge Broyles, employed a young lawyer, Mr. Underwood, to appear regularly in court and look after the interests of Negroes. Convicts Making a Profit for Georgia. One reason for the very large number of arrests, in Georgia particularly, lies in the fact that the state and the counties make a profit out of their prison system. No attempt is ever made to reform a criminal, either white or coloured. Convicts are hired out to private contractors or worked on the public roads. Last year the net profit to Georgia from its chain gangs, to which the Prison Commission refers with pride, reached the great sum of $354,853.55. Of course, a very large proportion of the prisoners are Negroes. The demand for convicts by rich sawmill operators, owners of brick yards, large farmers, and others is far in advance of the supply. The natural tendency is to convict as many men as possible. It furnishes steady, cheap labor to the contractors and a profit to the state. Undoubtedly this explains in some degree the very large number of criminals, especially Negroes, in Georgia. One of the leading political forces in Atlanta is a very prominent banker who is a dominant member of the city police board. He is also the owner of extensive brickyards near Atlanta, where many convicts are employed. Some of the large fortunes in Atlanta have come chiefly from the labor of chain gangs of convicts leased from the state. Fate of the Black Boy. As I have already suggested, one of the things that impressed me strongly in visiting Judge Broyles's court, and others like it, was the astonishing number of children, especially Negroes, arrested. Some of them were very young and often exceedingly bright looking. From the records I find that in 1906 one boy 6 years old, 7 of 7 years, 33 of 8 years, 69 of 9 years, 107 of 10 years, 142 of 11 years, and 219 of 12 years were arrested and brought into court. In other words, 578 boys and girls, mostly Negroes, under 12 years of age. "I should think," I said to a police officer, "you would have trouble in taking care of all these children in your reformatories." "Reformatories?" he said. "There aren't any." "What do you do with them?" "Well, if they're bad we put 'em in the stockade or the chain gang. Otherwise they're turned loose." I found, however, that a new state juvenile reformatory was just being opened in Milledgeville, which may accommodate a few Negro boys. An attempt is also being made in Atlanta to get hold of some of the children through a new probation system. I talked with the excellent officer, Mr. Glower, who works in conjunction with Judge Broyles. He reaches a good many white boys, but very few Negroes. Of 1,011 boys and girls under 16 arrested in 1905, 819 were black, but of those given the advantage of the probation system, 50 were white and only 7 colored. In other words, out of 819 arrests of Negro children, only 7 enjoyed the benefits of the probation system. Mr. Glower has endeavored to secure a colored assistant who would help look after the swarming Negro children who are becoming criminals. The city refused to appropriate money for that purpose, but some of the leading colored citizens agreed to contribute $1 a month each, and a Negro woman was employed to help with the colored children brought into court. Excellent work was done, but owing to the feeling after the riot, the Negro assistant discontinued her work. Care of Negro Orphans. With many hundreds of Negro orphans, waifs, and foundlings, the state or city does very little to help them. If it were not for the fact that the Negroes, something like the Jews, are wonderfully helpful to one another, adopting orphan children with the greatest willingness, there would be much suffering. Several orphanages in the state are conducted by the colored people themselves, either through their churches or by private subscription. In Atlanta, the Carey Steele Orphanage, which is managed by Negroes, has received an appropriation yearly from the city, and has taken children sent by the city charities department. After the riot the appropriation was suddenly cut off without explanation, but through the activities of the new Civic League it was, I understand, restored. Without proper reformatories or asylums, with small advantage of the probation system, hundreds of Negro children are on the streets of Atlanta every day, shooting craps, stealing, learning to drink. A few, shut up in the stockade or in chain gangs, without any attempt to reform them or teach them, take lessons in crime from older offenders, and come out worse than they went in. They spread abroad the lawlessness they learn and finally commit some frightful crime and get back into the chain gang for life, where they make a profit for the state. Every child, white or colored, is getting an education somewhere. If that education is not in schools or at home, or, in case of incorrigibility, in proper reformatories, then it is on the streets or in chain gangs. Why Negro children are not in school. My curiosity, aroused by the very large number of young prisoners, led me next to inquire why these children were not in school. I visited a number of schools, and I talked with L. M. Landrum, the assistant superintendent. Compulsory education is not enforced anywhere in the South, so that children may run the streets unless their parents insist upon sending them to school. I found more than this, however, that Atlanta did not begin to have enough school facilities for the children who wanted to go. Like many rapidly growing cities, both South and North, it has been difficult to keep up with the demand. Just as in the North the tenement classes are often neglected, so in the South the lower class, which is the Negro, is neglected. Several new schools have been built for white children, but there has been no new school for colored children in 15 or 20 years, though one Negro private school has been taken over within the last few years by the city. So crowded are the colored schools that they have 2 sessions a day, one squad of children coming in the forenoon, another in the afternoon. The colored teachers, therefore, do double work, for which they receive about 2/3 as much salary as the white teachers. Though many Southern cities have instituted industrial training in the public schools, Atlanta so far has done nothing. The president of the Board of Education, in his last published report, 1903, calls attention to this fact, and says also, "While on the subject of Negro schools, permit me to call your attention to their overcrowded condition. In every Negro school many teachers teach 2 sets of pupils, each set for 1/2 of a school day. The last bond election was carried by a majority of only 33 votes. To my personal knowledge more than 33 Negroes voted for the bonds on the solemn assurance that, by the passage of the bonds, the Negro children would receive more school accommodations." The eagerness of the colored people for a chance to send their children to school is something astonishing and pathetic. They will submit to all sorts of inconveniences in order that their children may get an education. One day I visited the mill neighborhood of Atlanta to see how the poorer classes of white people lived. I found one very comfortable home occupied by a family of mill employees. They hired a Negro woman to cook for them, and while they sent their children to the mill to work, the cook sent her children to school. How Negroes Educate Themselves. Here is a curious and significant thing I found in Atlanta. Because there is not enough room for Negro children in public schools, the colored people maintain many private schools. The largest of these, called Morris Brown College, has nearly 1,000 pupils. Some of them are boarders from the country, but the greater proportion are day pupils from 7 years old up who come in from the neighborhood. This college, in reality a grammar school, is managed and largely supported by tuition and contributions from Negroes, though some subscriptions are obtained in the North. Besides this college, there are many small private schools conducted by Negro women, and supported wholly by the tuition paid, the Negroes thus voluntarily taxing themselves heavily for their educational opportunities. One afternoon in Atlanta I passed a small, rather dilapidated home. Just as I reached the gate I heard a great cackling of voices and much laughter. Colored children began to pour out of the house. "What's this?" I said, and I turned in to see. I found a Negro woman, the teacher, standing in the doorway. She had just dismissed her pupils for recess. She was holding school in two little rooms where some 50 children must have been crowded to suffocation. Everything was very primitive and inconvenient, but it was a school. She collected, she told me, $1 a month tuition for each child. Molly McHugh's school, perhaps the best known private school for Negroes in the city, has 250 pupils. Many children also find educational opportunities in the Negro colleges of the city, Clark University, Atlanta University, and Spelman Seminary, which are supported partly by the Negroes themselves, but mostly by Northern philanthropy. Mr. Landrum gave me a copy of the last statistical report of the School Board, 1903, from which these facts appear. School population: white, 14,465; colored, 8,118. Number of schools: white, 20; colored, 5. Teachers: white, 200; colored, 49. With seats: white, 10,052; colored, 2,445. Without seats: white, 4,413; colored, 5,673. Even with a double daily session for colored pupils, nearly half of the Negro children in Atlanta, even in 1903, were barred from the public schools from lack of facilities, and the number has increased largely in the last 4 years. Some of these are accommodated in the private schools and colleges which I have mentioned, but there still remains hundreds, even thousands, who are getting no schooling of any kind, but who are nevertheless being educated on the streets and for criminal lives. White instruction for black children. I made a good many inquiries to find out what was being done outside of the public schools by the white people toward training the Negro either morally, industrially, or intellectually, and I was astonished to find that it was next to nothing. The Negro is, of course, not welcome at the white churches or Sunday schools, and the sentiment is so strong against teaching the Negro that it is a brave Southern man or woman indeed who dares attempt anything of the sort. I did find, however, that the Central Presbyterian Church of Atlanta conducted a Negro Sunday school. Of this Dr. Theron H. Rice, the pastor, said: "The Sunday school conducted in Atlanta by my church is the outcome of the effort of some of the most earnest and thoughtful of our people to give careful religious training to the Negroes of this generation, and thus to conserve the influence begun with the fathers and mothers and the grandfathers and grandmothers of these coloured children when they were taught personally by their devoted Christian masters and mistresses. The work is small in point of the number reached, but it has been productive of sturdy character and law-abiding citizenship. A white man or woman, and especially a Northern white man or woman, in Atlanta who teaches Negroes is rigorously ostracized by white society. I visited one of the Negro colleges where there are a number of white teachers from the North. We had quite a talk. When I came to leave, one of the teachers said to me, "You don't know how good it seems to talk with some one from the outside world. We work here year in and year out without a white visitor, except those who have some necessary business with the institution." Explaining the attitude toward these Northern teachers, and we must understand just how the Southern people feel in this matter, a prominent clergyman said that a lady who made a social call upon a teacher in that institution would not feel secure against having to meet Negroes socially, and that when the call was returned a similar embarrassing situation might be created. Apologizing for helping Negroes. Just in this connection, I found a very remarkable and significant letter published in the Orangeburg, South Carolina News, signed by a well-to-do white citizen who thus apologizes for a kind act to a Negro school. "I had left my place of business here on a business trip a few miles below. On returning I came by the above-mentioned school, the Prince Institute, colored, and was held up by the teacher and begged to make a few remarks to the children. Very reluctantly I did so, not thinking that publicity would be given to it, or that I was doing anything that would offend anyone. I wish to say here and now that I am heartily sorry for what I did, and I hope after this humble confession and expression of regret that all whom I have offended will forgive me." The sentiment indicated by this letter, while widely prevalent, is by no means universal. I have seen Southern white men address Negro schools and Negro gatherings many times since I have been down here. Some of the foremost men in the South have accepted Booker T. Washington's invitations to speak at Tuskegee. And concerning the very letter that I reproduce above, the Charlotte Observer, a strong Southern newspaper, which copied it, said: "A man would better be dead than to thus abase himself. This man did right to address the pupils of a coloured school, but has spoiled all by apologizing for it. Few people have conceived that race prejudice went so far, even in South Carolina, as is here indicated. Logically it is to be assumed that this jellyfish was about to be put under the ban, and to secure exemption from this, published this abject card. To it was appended a certificate from certain citizens, saying they are as anxious to see the coloured race elevated as any people, but by all means let it be done inside the colour line. The narrowness and malignity betrayed by this Orangeburg incident is exceedingly unworthy, and those guilty of it should be ashamed of themselves." The Rev. H. S. Bradley, for a long time one of the leading clergymen of Atlanta, now of St. Louis, said in a sermon published in the Atlanta Constitution: "We have not been wholly lacking in our effort to help. There are few schools and churches supported by Southern whites for the Negroes. Here and there a man like George Williams Walker, of the aristocracy of South Carolina, and a woman like Miss Belle H. Bennett, one of the blue blood of Kentucky, goes as teacher to the Negro youth and seeks, in a Christly spirit of fraternity, to bring them to a higher plane of civil and moral manhood, but the number like them can almost be counted on fingers of both hands. Our Southern churches have spent probably 100 times as much money since the Civil War in an effort to evangelize the people of China, Japan, India, South America, Africa, Mexico, and Cuba, as they have spent to give the gospel to the Negroes at our doors. It is often true that opportunity is overlooked because it lies at our feet." End of Chapter 3, Part 1. Part 2 of Chapter 3 of Following the Color Line, An Account of Negro Citizenship in the American Democracy, by Ray Stannard Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Concerning the Vagrant Negro. Before I get away from observations of the low-class Negro, I must speak of the subject of vagrancy. Many white men have told me with impatience of the great number of idle or partly idle Negroes, idle while every industry and most of the farming districts of Georgia are crying for more labor. And from my observation in Atlanta, I should say that there were a good many idle or partly idle Negroes, even after the riot which served, I understand, to drive many of them away. 5 days before the riot of last September, a committee of the City Council visited some 40 saloons one afternoon, and by actual count found 2,455 Negroes and 152 white men drinking at the bars or lounging around the doorways. In some of these saloons, conducted by white men and permitted to exist by the city authorities, pictures of nude white women were displayed as an added attraction. Has this anything to do with Negro crimes against white women? After the riot, these conditions in Atlanta were much improved, and in January 1908 all the saloons were closed. Increased Negro idleness is the result, in large measure, of the marvelous and rapid changes in Southern conditions. The South has been, and is today, dependent on a single labor supply, the Negro. Now Negroes, though recruited by a high birth rate, have not been increasing in any degree as rapid as the demand for labor incident to the development of every sort of industry, railroads, lumbering, mines, to say nothing of the increased farm area and the added requirements of growing cities. With this enormous increased demand for labor, the Negro supply has, relatively, been decreasing. Many have gone north and west. Many have bought farms of their own. Thousands, by education, have become professional men, teachers, preachers, and even merchants and bankers, always draining away the best and most industrious men of the race and reducing by so much the available supply of common labor. In short, those Negroes who were capable have been going the same way as the unskilled Irishman and German in the North, upward through the door of education. But, unlike the North, there have been no other laborers coming in to take their places. What has been the result? Naturally, a fierce contest between agriculture and industry for the limited and dwindling supply of the only labor they had. Negro monopoly on labor. So they bid against one another. It was as though the Negro had a monopoly on labor, and within the last few years day wages for Negro workers have jumped from 50 or 60 cents to $1.25 and $1.50, often more, a pure matter of competition. A similar advance has affected all sorts of servant labor, cooks, waiters, maids, porters. High wages, scarcity of labor, and the consequent loss of opportunity for taking advantage of the prevailing prosperity would, in any community, South or North, whether the labor was white or black, produce a spirit of impatience and annoyance on the part of the employing class. I found it evident enough last summer in Kansas, where the farmers were unable to get workers to save their crops, and the servant problem is not more provoking, certainly, in the South than in the North and West. Indeed, it is the labor problems more than any other one cause that has held the South back and is holding it back today. But the South has an added cause of annoyance. Higher wages, instead of producing more and better labor, as they would naturally be expected to do, have actually served to reduce the supply. This may at first seem paradoxical, but it is easily explainable and it lies deep down beneath many of the perplexities which surround the race problem. Most Negroes, as I have said, were, and still are of course, farm dwellers, and farm dwellers in the hitherto wasteful Southern way. Their living is easy to get and very simple. In that warm climate they need few clothes, a shack for a home. Their living standards are low. They have not learned to save. There has not been time since slavery for them to attain the sense of responsibility which would encourage them to get ahead. And moreover, they have been and are today largely under the discipline of white landowners. What was the effect, then, of rapid advance in wages? The poorer class of Negroes, naturally indolent and happy-go-lucky, found that they could make as much money in 2 or 3 days as they had formerly earned in a whole week. It was enough to live on as well as they had ever lived. Why, then, work more than 2 days a week? It was the logic of a child, but it was the logic used. Everywhere I went in the South I heard the same story. High wages, coupled with the difficulty of getting anything like continuous work from this class of coloured men. On the other hand, the better and more industrious Negroes, who would work continuously, and there are unnumbered thousands of them, as faithful as any workers, occasionally saved their surplus, bought little farms or businesses of their own, and began to live on a better scale. One of the first things they did after getting their footing was to take their wives and daughters out to the white man's kitchen, and to send their children from the cotton fields, where the white man needed them, to the schoolhouse, where the tendency, exactly as with white children, was to educate them away from farm employment. With the development of ambition and a higher standard of living, the Negro follows the steps of the rising Irishman or Italian. He has a better home, he wants his wife to take care of it, and he insists upon the education of his children. In this way, higher wages have tended to cut down the already limited supply of labor, producing annoyance, placing greater obstacles in the way of that material development of which the Southerner is so justly proud. And this, not at all unnaturally, has given rise on the one hand to complaints against the lazy Negro who will work only 2 days in the week, that he may loaf the other 5. And on the other hand, it has found expression in blind and bitter hostility to the education which enables the better sort of Negro to rise above the unskilled employment and the domestic service of which the South is so keenly in need. It is human nature to blame men, not conditions. Here is unlimited work to do. Here is the Negro who has been for centuries, and is today, depended upon to do it. It is not done. The natural result is to throw the blame wholly upon the Negro, and not upon the deep economic conditions and tendencies which have actually caused the scarcity of labor. Immigrants to take the Negro's places. But within the last year or two thinking men in the South have begun to see this particular root of the difficulty, and a great new movement looking to the encouragement of immigration from foreign countries has been started. In November 1906, the first shipload of immigrants ever brought from Europe directly to a South Carolina port were landed at Charleston with great ceremony and rejoicing. If a steady stream of immigrants can be secured, and if they can be employed on satisfactory terms with the Negro, it will go far toward relieving race tension in the South. Of course idleness leads to crime, and one of the present efforts in the South is toward a more rigid enforcement of laws against vagrancy. In this the white people have the sympathy of the leading Negroes. I was struck with one passage in the discussion at the last Workers' Conference at Tuskegee. William E. Holmes, president of a colored college at Macon, Georgia, was speaking. Someone interrupted him. "I would like to ask if you think the Negro is any more disposed to become loafer or vagrant than any other people under the same conditions?" "Well," said Mr. Holmes, taking a deep breath, "we cannot afford to do what other races do. We haven't a single solitary man or woman among us we can afford to support as an idler. It may be that other races have made so much progress that they can afford to support loafers, but we are not yet in that condition. Some of us have the impression that the world owes us a living. That is a misfortune. I must confess that I have become convinced that at the present time we furnish a larger number of loafers than any other race of people on this continent." These frank remarks did not meet with the entire approval of the members of the conference, but the discussion seemed to indicate that there was a great deal more of truth in them than the leaders and teachers of the Negro are disposed to admit. The Worthless Negro. I tried to see as much as I could of this worthless Negro, who is about the lowest stratum of humanity, it seems to me, of any in our American life. He is usually densely ignorant, often a wanderer, working today with a railroad gang, tomorrow on some city works, the next day picking cotton. He has lost his white friends, his white folks, as he calls them, and he has not attained the training or self-direction to stand alone. He works only when he is hungry, and he is as much a criminal as he dares to be. Many such Negroes are supported by their wives or by women with whom they live, for morality and the home virtues among this class are unknown. A woman who works as a cook in a white family will often take enough from the kitchen to feed a worthless vagabond of a man and keep him in idleness, or worse. A Negro song exactly expresses this state of beatitude. "I done has to work so hard, I's got a gal in a white man's yard. Every night, about 8:30, I goes around to the white man's gate. She brings me butter and she brings me lard. I don't has to work so hard." This worthless Negro, without training or education, grown up from the neglected children I have already spoken of, evident in his idleness around saloons and depots, this Negro provokes the just wrath of the people, and gives a bad name to the entire Negro race. In numbers he is of course small, compared with the 8,000,000 Negroes in the South who perform the enormous bulk of hard manual labor upon which rests Southern prosperity. How the Working Negro Lives. Above this low stratum of criminal or semi-criminal Negroes is a middle class, comprising the great body of the race, the workers. They are crowded into straggling settlements like Darktown and Jackson Row, a few owning their homes, but the majority renting precariously, earning good wages, harmless for the most part, but often falling into petty crime. Poverty here, however, lacks the tragic note that it strikes in the crowded sections of Northern cities. The temperament of the Negro is irrepressibly cheerful. He overflows from his small home and sings and laughs in his streets. No matter how ragged or forlorn he may be, good humor sits upon his countenance, and his squalor is not unpicturesque. A banjo, a mullet supper from time to time, an exciting revival, give him real joys. Most of the families of this middle class some of whom are deserted wives with children, have their white folks for whom they do washing, cooking, gardening, or other service, and all have church connections, so that they have a real place in the social fabric and a certain code of self-respect. I tried to see all I could of this phase of life. I visited many of the poorer Negro homes, and I was often received in squalid rooms with a dignity of politeness which would have done credit to a society woman. For the Negro naturally is a sort of Frenchman. And if I can sum up the many visits I made in a single conclusion, I should say, I think, that I was chiefly impressed by the tragic punishment meted out to ignorance and weakness by our complex society. I would find a home of 1 or 2 rooms meanly furnished, but having in one corner a glittering cottage organ, or on the mantel shelf a glorified gilt clock. Crayon portraits, inexpressibly crude and ugly, but framed gorgeously, are not uncommon. The first uncertain, primitive, not unpitiful, reachings out after some of the graces of a broader life. Many of these things are brought from agents, and the prices paid are extortionate. Often a Negro family will pay monthly for a year or so on some showy clock or chromo or music box or decorated mirror, paying the value of it 12 times a year, only to have it seized when through sickness or lack of foresight they fail to meet a single note. Installment houses prey upon them, pawnbrokers suck their blood, and they are infinitely the victims of patent medicines. It is rare indeed that I entered a Negro cabin, even the poorest, without seeing 1 or more bottles of some abominable cure-all. The amount yearly expended by Negroes for patent medicines, which are glaringly advertised in all Southern newspapers, must be enormous, millions of dollars. I had an interesting sidelight on conditions one day while walking in one of the most fashionable residence districts of Atlanta. I saw a magnificent gray stone residence standing somewhat back from the street. I said to my companion, who was a resident of the city, "That's a fine home." "Yes, stop a minute," he said. "I want to tell you about that. The Anti-Kink man lives there." "Anti-Kink?" I asked in surprise. "Yes. The man who occupies that house is one of the wealthiest men here. He made his money by selling to Negroes a preparation to smooth the kinks out of their wool. They're simply crazy on that subject." "Does it work?" "You haven't seen any straight-haired Negroes, have you?" he asked. Ignorance carries a big burden and climbs a rocky road. Old Mammies and Nurses The mass of coloured people still maintain, as I have said, a more or less intimate connection with white families, frequently a very beautiful and sympathetic relationship, like that of the mammies or nurses. To one who has heard so much of racial hatred as I have since I have been down here, a little incident that I observed the other day comes with a charm hardly describable. I saw a carriage stop in front of a home. The expected daughter had arrived, a very pretty girl indeed. She stepped out eagerly. Her father was halfway down to the gate, but ahead of him was a very old Negro woman in the cleanest of clean-starched dresses. "Honey!" she said eagerly. "Mammy!" exclaimed the girl, and the two rushed into each other's arms, clasping and kissing, the white girl and the old black woman. I thought to myself, there's no Negro problem there. That's just plain human love. Master superseded by boss. Often I have heard Negroes refer to "my white folks," and similarly the white man still speaks of "my Negroes." The old term of slavery, the use of the word "master," has wholly disappeared, and in its place has arisen, not without significance, the round term "boss," or sometimes "cap" or "cap'n." To this the white man responds with the first name of the Negro, Jim or Susie, or if the Negro is old or especially respected, Uncle Jim or Aunt Susan. To an unfamiliar Northerner one of the very interesting and somewhat amusing phases of conditions down here is the panic fear displayed over the use of the word "Mr." or "Mrs." No Negro is ever called Mr. or Mrs. by a white man. That would indicate social equality. A Southern white man told me with humor of his difficulties. "Now, I admire Booker Washington. I regard him as a great man, and yet I couldn't call him Mr. Washington. We were all in a quandary until a doctor's degree was given him. That saved our lives. We all call him Dr. Washington now." Sure enough. I don't think I have heard him called Mr. Washington since I came down here. It is always Doctor or just Booker. They are ready to call a Negro Professor or Bishop or the Reverend, but not Mr. In the same way a Negro may call Miss Mary Smith by the familiar Miss Mary, but if he called her Miss Smith she would be deeply incensed. The formal Miss Smith would imply social equality. I digress, but I have wanted to impress these relationships. There are all gradations of Negroes between the wholly dependent old family servant and the new educated Negro professional or business man, and, correspondingly, every degree of treatment from indulgence to intense hostility. I must tell, in spite of lack of room, one beautiful story I heard at Atlanta, which so well illustrates the old relationship. There is in the family of Dr. J. S. Todd, a well-known citizen of Atlanta, an old servant called affectionately Uncle Billy. He has been so long in the family that in reality he is served as much as he serves. During the riot last September he was terrified. He did not dare to go home at night. So Miss Louise, the doctor's daughter, took Uncle Billy home through the dark streets. When she was returning one of her friends met her and was much alarmed that she should venture out in a time of so much danger. "What are you doing out here this time of night?" he asked. "Why," she replied, as if it were the most natural answer in the world, "I had to take Uncle Billy safely home." Over against this story I want to reproduce a report from a Kentucky newspaper, which will show quite the other extreme. "Tennessee farmer has Negro bishop and his wife ejected from a sleeping car." "Irvine McGraw, a Tennessee farmer, brought Kentucky's Jim Crow law into prominent notice yesterday on an Illinois Central Pullman car. When McGraw entered the car he saw the colored divine, Rev. Dr. C. H. Phillips, Bishop of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Churches in Tennessee, North Carolina, Texas, and a portion of Arizona and New Mexico, and his wife preparing to retire for the night. He demanded that the conductor order them out of the car, but the conductor refused. After he entered Kentucky he hunted for an officer at every station, and finally at Hopkinsville Policeman Bryant Baker agreed to undertake the task of ejecting the Negroes from the car. The train was held 9 minutes while they dressed and repaired to the colored compartment. I have now described two of the three great classes of Negroes. First, the worthless and idle Negro, often a criminal, comparatively small in numbers but perniciously evident. Second, the great middle class of Negroes who do the manual work of the South. Above these, a third class, few in numbers, but most influential in their race, are the progressive, property-owning Negroes, who have wholly severed their old intimate ties with the white people, and who have been getting further and further away from them. A white man's problem. It keeps coming to me that this is more a white man's problem than it is a Negro problem. The white man as well as the black is being tried by fire. The white man is in full control of the South, politically, socially, industrially. The Negro, as ex-Governor Northen points out, is his helpless ward. What will he do with him? Speaking of the education of the Negro, and in direct reference to the conditions in Atlanta which I have already described, many men have said to me, "Think of the large sums that the South has spent and is spending on the education of the Negro. The Negro does not begin to pay for his education in taxes." Neither do the swarming Slavs, Italians, and Poles in our northern cities. They pay little in taxes, and yet enormous sums are expended in their improvement. For their benefit? Of course, but chiefly for ours. It is better to educate men in school than to let them so educate themselves as to become a menace to society. The present kind of education in the South may possibly be wrong, but for the protection of society it is as necessary to train every Negro as it is every white man. When I saw the crowds of young Negroes being made criminal through lack of proper training, I could not help thinking how pitilessly ignorance finally revenges itself upon that society which neglects or exploits it. End of chapter 3